There are moments in the wilderness when animals communicate with a clarity that transcends language. When a baby's cry means exactly what you think it means. Help me. Follow me. Something is terribly wrong. In Montana's Glacier National Park, Ranger Michael Torres encountered a 4-month-old grizzly bear cub. Alone and terrified, crying out not in fear of him but to him, begging with every desperate sound to be followed into the forest. Every instinct said this was a trap. Mother bears protect their young with lethal force. But this cub was alone, and its cries were too urgent to ignore. What Michael discovered when he finally followed that baby into the wilderness would break every heart, challenge every assumption about animal intelligence, and prove that sometimes the smallest creatures carry the heaviest burdens. Subscribe now, because what this cub was trying to show him will leave you speechless and changed forever. Michael Torres had been a Glacier National Park ranger for 8 years, long enough to know that baby grizzly bears were never, ever alone. A cub without its mother nearby meant one of 3 things. The mother was dead, the mother had abandoned it, or the mother was close enough to kill anyone who approached her baby. None of these scenarios ended well for humans. So when Michael rounded a bend on the 2 Medicine Lake Trail at dawn and found a tiny grizzly bear cub sitting in the middle of the path, actually crying with sounds that were heartbreakingly similar to a human child, every alarm in his head went off. The cub was maybe 4 months old, small enough to fit in a backpack, with fluffy light brown fur and dark eyes that locked onto Michael the moment he appeared. And instead of running away, instead of hiding, the cub did something that made Michael freeze in place. It ran toward him, crying, begging. "Whoa! Hey, stop," Michael said, holding up his hands, scanning the forest for the mother that had to be seconds away from charging. "Where's your mom, little guy? Where is she?" The cub reached him and did something no wild animal should do. It grabbed his pant leg with tiny claws and pulled, making that desperate crying sound, then released and ran a few feet back toward the forest. Stopped, looked back, cried again. Michael's heart was pounding. This wasn't natural behavior. This was deliberate communication. This cub was trying to show him something. He pulled out his radio. "Torres to base. I've got a lone grizzly bear cub on the 2 Medicine Trail, approximately 4 months old, exhibiting extremely unusual behavior. No sign of mother. The cub appears to be trying to lead me somewhere. Requesting backup and guidance, static." Then Ranger Sarah Klein's voice. "Negative on following, Torres. Lone cubs are a death trap. Mother is likely nearby and will attack on sight. Mark the location, retreat, and we'll send wildlife services. Sarah, this cub is desperate. Something is wrong. It's not acting like a scared baby. It's acting like it needs help. Michael, do not follow that cub. That's an order." Michael looked down at the baby grizzly bear, still crying, still pulling at his boots, still looking back toward the forest with an urgency that felt almost human. And he thought about his own daughter, Emily, who was 6 years old and had that same desperate look when she needed him to understand something important. "Sarah, I'm going to follow it. Just for a few minutes, just to see what it's trying to show me. Michael, you're violating protocol." He turned off the radio and looked at the cub. "Okay, little one, show me. Whatever it is, show me." The baby grizzly bear's crying shifted to something that sounded like relief. It turned and started running into the forest, stopping every few yards to make sure Michael was following. Its small body moving with desperate purpose through the underbrush. Michael followed, his hand on the bear spray at his belt, his mind screaming that this was the stupidest thing he'd ever done, his heart telling him that this cub wouldn't stop crying until someone understood what it was trying to say. After 10 minutes of hiking through increasingly dense forest, the cub's cries changed. They became more frantic, more urgent, mixed with a sound Michael had never heard from a bear before, a sound that was unmistakably anguish, and then he smelled it. The iron-sharp scent of blood. The cub stopped at the edge of a small ravine, crying uncontrollably now, looking at Michael, then down into the ravine, then back at Michael. Michael approached the edge carefully and looked down. What he saw made his breath catch, and his eyes burn with sudden tears. At the bottom of the ravine, partially hidden by brush, lay an adult female grizzly bear. She wasn't moving, and caught beneath her massive body, trapped and unable to escape, was a second cub, smaller than the one beside Michael, barely alive, making weak mewing sounds. The mother was dead, and she'd fallen on her other baby, pinning it beneath her 400-pound body, in a position the surviving cub couldn't possibly free its sibling from alone. Michael understood with devastating clarity what he was seeing. This baby had just led a human to its dying sibling, because it was the only way to save a life it couldn't save on its own. Michael scrambled down the ravine, his boots sliding on loose rock, the crying cub right behind him. Up close, the scene was even more heartbreaking. The mother grizzly bear had clearly died from a fall. Her neck was at an unnatural angle, and blood pooled beneath her massive body. She'd been trying to cross the ravine when she'd slipped, and in falling, she'd landed on the smaller of her two cubs. The trapped cub was barely breathing, its tiny body crushed beneath its mother's weight, only its head and one front paw visible. It was weaker than its sibling, smaller, and from the shallow breathing, Michael guessed it had been trapped for hours, maybe since last night. The surviving cub pressed against Michael's leg, still crying, pushing him toward its sibling as if to say, "Fix this. Please fix this." "Okay, baby, I see. I see your brother." Michael's voice cracked. He pulled out his radio, hands shaking. "Sarah, I need help. I need it now." Mother grizzly bear dead from fall, one cub trapped beneath her body, critical condition. "Second cub is with me, it led me here. We need lifting equipment, wildlife medical, everything. Coordinates," he rattled off his GPS position. "Jesus, Michael. Are you safe? Is the cub aggressive?" Michael looked down at the baby grizzly bear pressed against his legs, still crying, looking up at him with eyes that held something he'd never seen in a wild animal before. Hope. Desperate, fragile hope that this human could do what it couldn't. "No, it's not aggressive. It's asking for help. Sarah, it deliberately led me to save its sibling. This is unprecedented behavior. Team is mobilizing. ETA 30 minutes. Michael, do not attempt to move that mother bear alone. Even dead, that's 400 pounds that could shift and crush you or the trapped cub, but 30 minutes might be too long." The trapped cub's breathing was getting shallower, its tiny mews weaker. Michael assessed the situation with the emergency training all rangers received. The mother's body was resting at an angle against a fallen log. If he could lever the log, create just a few inches of space, he might be able to pull the trapped cub free. "I'm going to try something," Michael said into the radio. "If you don't hear from me in 5 minutes, assume the worst." He found a sturdy branch and wedged it beneath the log, using a rock as a fulcrum. The surviving cub watched every movement with intense focus, as if understanding exactly what Michael was trying to do. "Okay, little one. When I lift this, I need you to stay back, understand? I can't save your sibling if I'm worried about you." The cub made a soft sound, not crying now, but acknowledging, and moved back a few feet. Watching, waiting, Michael put all his weight on the branch. The log shifted. The mother bear's body lifted slightly, just 2 inches, but enough. The trapped cub whimpered. "Come on, baby, help me out," Michael grunted, straining to hold the weight. "Can you crawl? Can you move?" The trapped cub tried. Its tiny front paw scrabbled weakly at the ground, but it was too weak, too injured. It couldn't free itself. Michael made a split-second decision that was either heroic or suicidal. He braced the branch with a rock to hold the weight, then reached beneath the massive dead bear, his hands finding the trapped cub's small body, and pulled. The cub came free just as the makeshift brace gave way, and the mother's body settled back down with a heavy thud that would have crushed Michael's arm if he'd been a second slower. He held the tiny, barely breathing grizzly bear cub against his chest, feeling its weak heartbeat, and looked at its sibling, the one that had saved its life by doing the impossible. "You did it," Michael whispered to the crying cub. "You brought help. You saved your brother." The surviving cub approached slowly, touching its nose to its sibling's small head, making soft sounds that were no longer cries but something gentler, something that sounded like relief mixed with grief, because their mother was gone, but they had each other. And this strange human had answered the plea. Michael sat in the ravine with 2 orphaned grizzly bear cubs, one barely clinging to life, one that had just demonstrated problem-solving and communication abilities that would rewrite what scientists thought possible, and he made a promise he had no authority to make. "I've got you both. I'm not letting either of you die, I promise." The rescue team arrived 23 minutes later. Sarah Klein, veterinary specialist Dr. Lisa Park, and 2 other rangers with medical equipment. They found Michael sitting against a tree with both cubs in his lap, the healthier one curled protectively around its injured sibling, Michael's jacket wrapped around both tiny bodies to keep them warm. "Mother Bear is deceased," Michael reported, his voice hoarse. "Looks like she fell last night. This one," he gestured to the stronger cub, "spent hours trying to free its sibling, couldn't do it, then made a choice I can barely comprehend. It went to find a human. Not just any human. It found me on the trail and deliberately led me here." Dr. Park knelt beside the cubs, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Stronger cub appears uninjured, just exhausted and dehydrated. The trapped one, she paused, her expression grave. Crushed ribs, possible internal bleeding, severe hypothermia, respiratory distress. "Michael, this cub should be dead. The fact that it survived this long." "Its sibling kept it warm," Michael interrupted. "Look at the pattern of the fur, the way they were positioned. The healthy cub spent all night lying against its trapped sibling, sharing body heat, keeping it alive until it could bring help." Sarah stared at the cubs, then at Michael. "That's not just instinct. That's planning. That's understanding that help existed and how to get it. That's consciousness," Dr. Park finished quietly. "That's proof of consciousness and abstract reasoning in a 4-month-old wild animal. This cub assessed a problem it couldn't solve, identified a solution that required human intervention, overcame its natural fear to approach a human, and successfully communicated its need. That's beyond anything documented. The healthier cub," Michael had started thinking of it as Scout in his head, watched the humans with wary but trusting eyes as Dr. Park worked on its sibling. When she inserted an IV line and the injured cub whimpered in pain, Scout made a soft sound and pressed closer, as if offering comfort. "We need to get them both to the wildlife center immediately," Dr. Park said. "The injured one needs surgery, and Scout here needs evaluation and hydration." "But Michael—" She looked up at him with an expression that was part wonder, part heartbreak. "Even with surgery, the injured cub's chances are maybe 30%. The internal damage is severe. You need to prepare for the possibility that Scout's sacrifice, bringing you here, saving its sibling temporarily, might not be enough." Michael looked at Scout, at the brave little bear who'd done everything right, who'd overcome instinct and fear to save family. And he felt his throat tighten. What happens to Scout if its sibling doesn't make it? If Scout ends up alone? Orphaned cubs usually go to rehabilitation facilities, then eventual release if they're healthy. But Michael, this cub has now had extensive human contact, has learned that humans can help. That could make it dangerous, too comfortable with people, likely to approach hikers, potentially creating conflicts. "So you're saying Scout saved its sibling, demonstrated intelligence that should get it protected and studied, and the reward might be permanent captivity or euthanization because it's too smart and too trusting?" The silence that followed was damning. Sarah finally spoke. "There are no good options here, Michael. This is an impossible situation that this cub created by being too intelligent for its own good." Scout looked up at Michael with those dark, aware eyes and made a soft questioning sound, asking if its sibling would be okay, asking if it had done the right thing, asking if the human it had trusted would help. Michael made his second unauthorized decision of the day. "I'm staying with them. Both of them. Through surgery, through recovery, through whatever comes next. Scout trusted me. I'm not abandoning that trust." Dr. Park nodded slowly. "Then let's move. Every minute counts." They carried both cubs to the helicopter on stretchers, Scout refusing to be separated from its sibling, making distressed sounds whenever the humans tried to create distance between them. In the end, they transported both cubs on the same stretcher. Scout's small body curled protectively around its injured brother, just as it had been all night in that ravine, and as the helicopter lifted off, Michael watched Scout's small paw rest on its sibling's chest, checking for breathing, for heartbeat, for life, a 4-month-old wild animal monitoring vital signs like a trained medic, unthinkable, but undeniable. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Dr. Park and her team worked in the Wildlife Medical Center, while Michael sat in the observation room, watching through glass as they repaired crushed ribs, stopped internal bleeding, and fought to save a life that probably should have ended beneath its mother's body 12 hours ago. Scout refused to leave the observation window. The cub sat pressed against the glass, watching every movement the veterinarians made, making soft, distressed sounds whenever its siblings' vital signs dropped. The medical staff had tried to move Scout to a recovery pen, but the cub had become so agitated, crying, clawing at the door, showing signs of severe distress, that they'd brought it back. "I've never seen attachment behavior this intense in such a young cub," Dr. Park said during a brief break, watching Scout through the window. "Grizzly bear cubs stay with their mothers for 2 years, yes, but sibling bonds typically dissolve after separation from the mother. Scout should be focused on its own survival, not fixated on its brother. This level of devotion, this refusal to leave, it's more consistent with human familial bonding than bear behavior." "Maybe we've been wrong about what bear behavior actually is," Michael suggested. "Maybe we've just never had the chance to document it properly, because we've always kept our distance." At hour 3 of the surgery, Scout did something that made every person in the observation room stop and stare. The injured cub's heart rate had dropped dangerously low, the monitor beeping frantically. Scout stood on hind legs against the glass, pressed both front paws to the window, and began making a sound, not crying, not distressed, but a rhythmic vocalization that was almost like calling, like trying to reach its sibling through the barrier, and impossibly the injured cub's heart rate stabilized. Slowly but steadily, it climbed back to safer levels. "That's not possible," Sarah breathed. "There's no way the cub in surgery could hear through soundproof glass, and even if it could, there's no biological mechanism for..." "For what?" Michael interrupted. "For one sibling calling another back from the edge? For connection that transcends physical barriers. We don't know what's not possible, Sarah. We're watching it happen." The surgery ended at hour 4 with Dr. Park's cautious optimism. "We've done everything we can. The next 24 hours will tell us if it's enough. But I have to say, this cub has a will to live that I've rarely seen, almost like it knows its sibling is waiting for it." They moved both cubs to a recovery enclosure, against standard protocol. But Scout's distress at separation had been deemed more dangerous than keeping them together. The healthy cub immediately curled around its unconscious sibling, maintaining contact, keeping watch, that small paw resting on its brother's chest. Michael stayed through the night, dozing in a chair outside the enclosure, waking every hour when Scout would make a soft sound, checking if Michael was still there, if the human who'd helped was still keeping watch. At 3 a.m., Michael was jolted awake by a different sound. Not distress, but excitement. He rushed to the enclosure window and saw Scout standing over its sibling, making happy chirping sounds. The injured cub's eyes were open. Weak, barely conscious, but alive and aware. Its tiny paw reached up to touch Scout's face, and Scout's response was a sound of such pure joy that Michael felt tears stream down his face. Brothers. Not just siblings by biology, but brothers by choice, by sacrifice, by a bond that had survived a mother's death and a night of impossible odds. Sarah appeared beside Michael, holding 2 cups of coffee, her eyes also wet. "This story is going to go public, you know. The footage from your body camera, the surgery documentation, Scout's behavior, it's all being reviewed by wildlife biology departments across the country. Michael, you've documented something that's going to change policy, change how we understand cognition in wild animals." "I don't care about policy," Michael said quietly, watching the 2 cubs touch noses through the glass. "I care about Scout's choice not being punished. I care about these 2 getting a chance at life, after demonstrating more courage and intelligence than most humans ever show." "Then we need to fight for them," Sarah replied, "because as of this morning, Wildlife Services has flagged Scout as human-habituated and potentially dangerous. They want both cubs moved to permanent captivity facilities, separately." Michael's hand clenched around his coffee cup. "Over my dead body." The battle for Scout and its sibling, whom the medical team had named Brave for surviving the impossible, became a media sensation within 48 hours. Michael's body camera footage went viral, a tiny grizzly bear cub crying and begging a ranger to follow, leading him through the forest, the heartbreaking reveal of the mother's body and trapped sibling, Scout's desperate attempts to communicate. Genius grizzly bear cub saves sibling's life became the most watched wildlife video in history. Millions watched Scout pressing its paws to the surgery room glass, calling its brother back from the edge of death. The footage of the 2 cubs reuniting, Scout's joy, Brave's weak but responding paw, it destroyed hearts worldwide. But the public outcry didn't change Wildlife Service's position. Human-habituated bears pose significant danger, their official statement read. Scout has learned to approach humans for assistance, which creates dangerous precedent. Both cubs will be relocated to accredited facilities where they can live safely without posing risk to park visitors. Separately, Michael demanded in the emergency meeting with Park Administration, Wildlife Services representatives, and Dr. Park. You're going to separate them after what Scout did to save Brave. After documenting the most profound sibling bond ever recorded in wild bears, Mr. Torres, emotional attachment doesn't change safety protocols. The Wildlife Services Director, James Brennan, replied coldly. These are wild animals, not pets. The public is anthropomorphizing. The public is recognizing consciousness. Michael slammed his hand on the table. Scout didn't just act on instinct. Scout planned. Scout communicated. Scout made a choice that required understanding of human capability, understanding of time, understanding that help existed outside its species. That's not anthropomorphizing, that's acknowledging observable reality. Dr. Park spoke up, her voice measured but firm. Director Brennan, I've been a wildlife veterinarian for 20 years. I've treated hundreds of bear cubs. What Scout demonstrated isn't normal bear behavior. It's extraordinary cognitive ability that deserves protection and study, not punishment. And separating these cubs after the documented trauma and bonding would be, in my professional opinion, cruel and scientifically counterproductive. Your opinion is noted, Brennan replied. But policy is clear. The cubs will be separated for their own good. Siblings in the wild separate naturally after 2 years. We're simply accelerating that timeline. They're 4 months old. Michael's voice rose. And they just lost their mother. Scout's entire world is Brave right now. If you separate them, you'll destroy the one thing that kept both of them alive, each other. The meeting ended with no resolution. Separation orders would proceed unless legal intervention occurred within 72 hours. That night, Michael sat outside the cubs' enclosure, watching Scout and Brave sleep curled together. Brave's breathing still weak but steady, Scout's paw resting protectively on its sibling's side, and he made a phone call to someone he'd never thought he'd contact. Rebecca Martinez, a wildlife advocacy attorney who specialized in animal cognition cases. I've seen the footage, Rebecca said immediately. Everyone has. Michael, if you're asking me to take this case, you need to understand we're not just fighting for 2 cubs. We're fighting to establish legal precedent that cognitive complexity grants certain rights, that conscious beings deserve protection from separation and captivity when they've demonstrated awareness. This could change everything. Then let's change everything, Michael replied, because Scout did everything right, and the system is going to punish it for being too smart. That's not justice. Agreed. I'll file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. But Michael, we need more than emotion. We need expert testimony that Scout's behavior was genuinely unprecedented. Can Dr. Park testify? Yes. And I can get you 5 wildlife biologists who've reviewed the footage and are calling it the most significant documentation of bear cognition ever. Recorded. Good. Because we're going to argue that Scout and Brave aren't just animals, they're conscious individuals with demonstrable emotional bonds, and separating them constitutes harm. It's never been successfully argued for wild bears before. Then we'll be the first, Michael said, watching Scout shift slightly in sleep, even unconscious, maintaining contact with its brother. The injunction was filed at 9 a.m. the next morning. By noon, the story had exploded. Ranger fights to keep genius bear cubs together. By evening, 2 million people had signed an online petition demanding Wildlife Services reverse its decision, and in a small recovery enclosure, 2 orphaned grizzly bear cubs slept peacefully, unaware that their bond had become the center of a legal and ethical battle that would determine not just their futures, but how humanity viewed consciousness itself in the wild animals we claim to protect. The emergency hearing took place 1 week after Scout had led Michael into the forest. The cubs were now in a temporary holding facility, still together pending the court's decision. Brave was recovering steadily, gaining strength each day, while Scout remained vigilantly protective, showing no signs of the fear of humans that wild bears should naturally possess. Rebecca Martinez presented her case with surgical precision, calling expert after expert who testified to Scout's unprecedented cognitive abilities. Dr. Park showed the surgery footage, explaining how Scout's vocalizations appear to influence Brave's vital signs. Wildlife behaviorist Dr. James Whitmore analyzed Michael's body camera footage frame by frame, demonstrating deliberate communication patterns. Scout didn't just approach Ranger Torres randomly, Dr. Whitmore testified. Scout waited on the trail at a known ranger patrol time. Scout used specific vocalizations that changed based on Torres's response. Scout repeatedly checked to ensure Torres was following, adjusting pace and stopping to wait. This is goal-oriented behavior requiring theory of mind, understanding that another being has knowledge and capabilities you don't, and can be recruited to help. That level of cognition places Scout in a category with great apes, elephants, and cetaceans, animals we recognize as deserving special protection. Director Brennan's attorney countered, "Special protection doesn't mean treating wild animals like humans. The cubs need to be in facilities where they can be properly cared for, and separation is standard practice to prevent unhealthy codependence." Rebecca stood for her final argument. "Your Honor, Wildlife Services calls Scout and Brave's bond unhealthy codependence. I call it love. I call it family. Scout watched its mother die, spent a night keeping its sibling alive, overcame every survival instinct to seek human help, and succeeded in communicating across species barriers to save a life. We're not asking the court to treat these bears like humans. We're asking the court to recognize that consciousness, emotional bonds, and intelligence exist in non-human forms, and that our obligation is to protect those qualities, not punish them." She played one final piece of footage recorded that morning. Scout and Brave playing together in the enclosure. Brave still weak but mobile. Scout constantly checking on its sibling. Both cubs displaying joy, security, and health that every veterinarian agreed was directly tied to their continued proximity. "Separate them," Rebecca said quietly. "And you tell every intelligent animal in the wild that the reward for trusting humans is loss. Keep them together, and you tell the world that we're capable of recognizing consciousness beyond our own species and honoring it." The judge, an older woman, named Elena Vasquez, who'd grown up on a ranch and understood animals, watched the footage of the cubs playing, watched Scout gently touch Brave's healing ribs with its nose, checking the injury, watched Brave lean into Scout for comfort. "I'll issue my ruling in 24 hours, she said. "But I want to be clear. This case has implications far beyond two bear cubs. We're establishing precedent about how cognitive ability affects wildlife management policy. Whatever I decide will be cited for decades." That night, Michael sat outside the cubs' temporary enclosure, watching them sleep. Scout woke at one point, saw Michael, and made that soft questioning sound, the one that meant, "Are we safe? Are you still here?" "I'm here," Michael whispered. "I promised, remember." Scout seemed to understand. The cub settled back against Brave, one paw over its sibling's back, and closed its eyes. Trusting. Still trusting. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Judge Vasquez delivered her ruling. The courtroom was packed with media, wildlife advocates, and curious observers. Michael stood beside Rebecca, his hands clenched, barely breathing. "In the matter of Scout and Brave, the orphaned grizzly bear cubs," Judge Vasquez began, "I find that the evidence presented demonstrates cognitive abilities and emotional bonding that warrant special consideration." However, Michael's heart sank. Special consideration doesn't mean ignoring the safety concerns that Wildlife Services has raised. Therefore, my ruling is as follows. She paused, looked directly at Michael, and something in her expression shifted. These cubs will remain together. They will be placed in a specialized wildlife sanctuary that can accommodate their unique needs, proper bear habitat with minimal human contact, but oversight that ensures their bond is maintained. They will not be separated. Furthermore, I'm ordering a comprehensive study of their cognitive development, with the understanding that what we learn from Scout and Brave may reshape how we approach wildlife management for intelligent species. The courtroom erupted. Michael felt his knees weaken with relief. Rebecca grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Scout and Brave were transferred to the Montana. Wildlife Sanctuary 3 weeks after the ruling, a 500-acre facility that specialized in rehabilitating intelligent species with the goal of eventual release. It was the compromise everyone could live with. The cubs would remain together, grow up learning proper bear behaviors from minimal-contact human caregivers, and if they demonstrated the ability to survive in the wild, despite their early trauma, they could potentially be released as adults. But what happened over the next 2 years was what truly made the story unthinkable. Scout didn't just recover from the trauma of losing its mother. Scout thrived, becoming the facility's most remarkable resident, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that forced researchers to continually revise their understanding of bear cognition. Scout learned to operate complex puzzle feeders designed for great apes. Scout recognized individual humans by sight and voice, responding differently to each. And most remarkably, Scout began teaching. When other orphaned cubs arrived at the sanctuary, Scout would approach their enclosures and demonstrate behaviors: how to fish, how to dig for roots, how to navigate the climbing structures. The staff began calling Scout the Professor, and the nickname stuck. Brave, whose injuries had healed completely except for a slight limp, remained quieter, but equally remarkable. Where Scout was bold and communicative, Brave was cautious and observant. Together, they formed a unit that Sanctuary Director Maria Gonzalez described as the most profound example of cooperative intelligence I've witnessed in 30 years of wildlife work. Michael visited every month, and Scout always recognized him, approaching the fence line, making that soft questioning sound, allowing Michael to see that both cubs were healthy and happy. The trust hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened into something that looked remarkably like friendship. On the 2nd anniversary of their rescue, the sanctuary made an announcement that shocked the wildlife community. Scout and Brave would be released back into Glacier National Park. Not into the wild blindly, but into a monitored zone where they could live free while researchers tracked their integration, their survival, and their continued bond. They've demonstrated every skill necessary for survival, Maria explained at the press conference. But more than that, they've demonstrated that consciousness, family bonds, and learned trust can coexist with wildness. We're not releasing broken animals. We're releasing 2 bears who understand both their nature and that humans can be allies, not just threats. The release day was filmed by National Geographic. Michael was there, standing at the tree line as the transport crates were opened. Scout emerged first, cautious, sniffing the air of the wilderness it had been born in but barely remembered. Then Brave, staying close to its sibling, both cubs scanning their surroundings. Scout looked back at Michael one final time, and Michael did something he'd never done before. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening, and spoke directly to the bear who'd changed his life. "You saved your brother by trusting me. Now I'm trusting you. Live well, stay together. And if you ever need help again, you know where to find it." Scout held his gaze for a long moment, then made a sound, not crying, not questioning, but acknowledging, understanding. Then both cubs turned and walked into the forest side by side, disappearing into the trees. They were tracked for the next 5 years via GPS collars. The data told an extraordinary story. Scout and Brave maintained their bond into adulthood, unprecedented for male grizzly bears who typically become solitary. They established adjacent territories, shared fishing sites, and even denned near each other during winter. And most remarkably, they avoided human conflict entirely, not from fear, but from what researchers believed was understanding. Scout learned that humans could help, but also learned boundaries, Dr. Park explained in her final research paper. Both cubs demonstrated that intelligence and wildness aren't opposites. They're complementary. These bears are wild, but they're wild with understanding. The footage of Scout leading Michael to save Brave has been viewed over 500 million times. It's shown in wildlife biology courses, ethics classes, and consciousness studies worldwide. Scout and Brave's story became the cornerstone argument for the Animal Consciousness Protection Act, passed by Congress 3 years after their release, which granted special protections to animals demonstrating advanced cognitive abilities. But for Michael, it was simpler than policy or science. It was about a baby bear who'd been brave enough to ask for help, smart enough to know where to find it, and loving enough to risk everything for family. 10 years after the rescue, Michael, now Glacier's head of wildlife management, was hiking near Two Medicine Lake when he heard a sound that made him stop cold. A soft, questioning vocalization, not threatening, just greeting. He turned and saw, standing at the tree line, an enormous adult male grizzly bear with a distinctive small scar on its shoulder, where surgery had saved its life a decade ago. Brave. And beside him, equally massive, equally magnificent Scout. Both bears had lived. Both had thrived. And both had remembered. They stood there for 30 seconds, human and bears, separated by species but connected by memory and gratitude. Then the bears turned and walked back into the forest, together as they'd always been, as they always would be. Michael wiped his eyes and continued his patrol, carrying the weight of a promise kept and the gift of witnessing something that should have been impossible. Proof that consciousness, love and trust exist in forms we're only beginning to understand. If we're brave enough to see them, if this story broke your heart and rebuilt it, if it changed how you see intelligence and emotion in wild animals, leave a comment about a time when an animal showed you something about courage, love, or trust that defied explanation. And if you believe that consciousness deserves protection regardless of species, that family bonds matter, whether they're human or wild, hit that subscribe button. Because the world is full of scouts and braves, asking us to see them, to help them, to recognize that we share this planet with beings who think, feel, and love in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. Thank you for witnessing Scout and Brave's journey. May we all be brave enough to answer when the wild calls for help. See you in the next story.